The morning sun spilled across the eastern ridge of my property, painting the tall grass in shades of gold and amber. I stood on the porch of my newly purchased ranch house, a steaming mug of coffee warming my hands as I surveyed the land that now belonged to me. 50 acres of rolling hills, scattered oak trees, and a small creek cutting through the back portion where deer often came to drink at dawn. This place represented everything I had worked for over the past 15 years. My grandfather would have been proud. I could almost feel him standing beside me, his weathered hand on my shoulder, telling me that I had done good. It was him who taught me to hunt when I was just 8 years old. Not just how to track and shoot, but how to respect the land and the animals, how to take only what you need, and how to use every part of what you take. Those lessons stayed with me through my adult life, even when I moved to the city for work. The ranch had been on the market for nearly a year before I could afford it. Located just outside the growing suburb of Oak Ridge, it offered the perfect balance of rural tranquility with convenient access to town when needed. The previous owner had passed away, and his children, all living in different states, had no interest in keeping the property. Their loss was my gain. I had liquidated my retirement savings, sold my city condo, and taken out a substantial loan to make it happen. I took a long sip of coffee and smiled at the memory of my first week here. The neighbors from the subdivision that bordered the eastern edge of my property had been surprisingly welcoming. The Johnsons brought over a homemade apple pie. The Millers offered to help me fix the sagging fence line. Even Mrs. Patterson, an elderly widow who lived alone in the blue house closest to my property, had stopped by with a plant as a housewarming gift. That first month was peaceful. I settled into a routine, fixing up the house during the day and exploring my land in the evenings. The fall hunting season was approaching, and I spent weekends scouting deer trails and setting up a hunting blind near the North Ridge, far from any houses or roads. Everything was perfect. I felt at home for the first time in years. Then the letter arrived. The envelope was crisp white with an embossed logo in the corner reading, Oak Ridge Estates Homeowners Association. I frowned, turning it over in my hands. I did not live in Oak Ridge Estates. My property predated the development by decades. Curious, I opened it and pulled out a formal notice printed on heavy cardstock. Violation notice, unauthorized hunting activities. I read the letter twice, my confusion turning to disbelief. According to this notice, someone had reported seeing me carrying hunting equipment on community property, and the HOA was issuing me a fine of $250 for violating their bylaws prohibiting hunting. There must be some mistake. I was hunting on my own property, not in their subdivision. At the bottom of the letter was a signature in flowing blue ink. Victoria Harrington, HOA President. Below that was a note indicating that payment was due within 15 days, or additional penalties would apply. I set my coffee down and stared out at my land, the peaceful morning suddenly feeling much less welcoming. Something was very wrong, and I needed to figure out exactly what was happening before this went any further. The kitchen table disappeared beneath a sprawl of documents. My property deed lay in the center, surrounded by boundary maps, county records, and the growing pile of correspondence from the Oak Ridge Estates HOA. A single overhead light cast harsh shadows across the papers as I hunched over them, circling boundary lines and making notes. It was well past midnight, but sleep was impossible with this hanging over my head. 3 days after receiving the first violation notice, a second letter had arrived, increasing the fine to $350 for non-payment and continued violations. I had called the number listed on the letterhead that same day, asking to speak with Victoria Harrington. The receptionist informed me that Mrs. Harrington was very busy but would return my call. She never did. I traced my finger along the property line on the original survey map. According to this document, my land extended a full quarter-mile beyond where I had been hunting. There was no overlap with Oak Ridge Estates. I picked up the phone and dialed the county assessor's office for the third time that week. "I am sorry, sir, but according to our records, there was an easement agreement filed by the previous owner in 2016, the clerk explained patiently. It grants limited oversight to the Oak Ridge Estates HOA for the eastern portion of your property that borders their nature preserve." "Nature preserve?" I questioned, frantically flipping through my paperwork. "That was never mentioned in the sale documents." "It should have been disclosed during your purchase," she replied. "The easement allows for shared maintenance responsibilities of the watershed area and some limited environmental regulations." I thanked her and hung up, my stomach knotting with anger. Something had been deliberately concealed during my purchase. The question was whether it was an oversight or intentional. Either way, I needed to address this directly with the HOA board. They could not possibly have the authority to prevent me from hunting on my own land. The community center hosting the monthly HOA meeting was modern and sterile, with uncomfortable plastic chairs arranged in neat rows facing a long table at the front. About 30 residents were already seated when I arrived, most dressed in business casual attire despite the evening hour. I felt distinctly out of place in my jeans and flannel shirt. Victoria Harrington sat center at the board table, her silver blonde hair pulled into a tight chignon. She wore a cream blazer with gold buttons and spoke with practiced authority to the board members flanking her. Even from across the room, I could sense her calculating presence. When the public comment period began, I approached the microphone set up in the aisle. "My name is James Turner," I began, my voice steady despite my nervousness. "I recently purchased the old Davidson ranch that borders your community. I have received violation notices regarding hunting on my own property, and I would like to understand the legal basis for these fines." Victoria's perfectly penciled eyebrows arched slightly. "Ah yes, Mr. Turner, we have been expecting you to address this matter." Her voice was smooth as polished marble. "The regulations are quite clear. The eastern watershed of your property falls under our environmental protection guidelines, which prohibit hunting, trapping, or discharge of firearms." "I have reviewed my deed and property records," I countered, holding up my folder of documents. "While there appears to be an easement for watershed maintenance, nothing grants the HOA authority to restrict legal hunting activities on private property." A murmur rippled through the audience. Victoria's pleasant expression did not change, but her eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly. "Mr. Turner, the agreement signed by Mr. Davidson clearly states that all activities must comply with HOA bylaws in the designated areas. Hunting poses safety concerns for our residents who use the adjacent nature trails. The board's decision is final. Your fine now stands at $500 with late penalties." I looked around the room, hoping to find some support among the residents. A few people avoided my gaze, suddenly interested in their phones or the ceiling. One older gentleman near the front nodded slightly in my direction, seeming to indicate sympathy, but said nothing. "This is my livelihood and family tradition we are talking about," I insisted. "I have every legal right to hunt on my property with proper safety measures in place." "Perhaps in your previous environment," Victoria replied, emphasizing the word with thinly veiled disdain. "But here in Oak Ridge Estates, we prioritize community safety and environmental stewardship. Now, if there are no further comments, we need to move on to other business." Just like that, I was dismissed. As I walked back to my truck, I noticed several neighbors from my welcome week hurrying in the opposite direction, suddenly engrossed in conversation with each other. The Millers, who had offered to help with my fence, quickly ducked into their SUV without acknowledging me. The sense of isolation was immediate and deliberate. I stood alone in the parking lot, watching taillights disappear into the distance, feeling like an outsider in what should have been my new community. The violation notices continued to arrive with alarming regularity, each one more aggressive than the last, with penalties growing from hundreds to thousands of dollars. The third notice came in a red envelope marked urgent and threatened legal action if the accumulated fines remained unpaid. The fourth mentioned potential property liens. By the fifth notice, the HOA was threatening to involve their attorneys and seek a court order restricting all hunting activities on my entire property, not just the disputed eastern section. I spread the growing collection across my kitchen counter, arranging them chronologically like evidence in a criminal case. The total now exceeded $3,000 in fines and administrative fees. This was becoming more than a neighborhood dispute. It was financial warfare. My trip to consult with a local attorney had been disappointing at best. Bernard Michaels, a balding man with coffee-stained teeth and a cluttered office in a strip mall, had barely glanced at my documents before shaking his head. HOAs are notoriously difficult to fight, Mr. Turner, he said, leaning back in his creaking chair. Courts tend to uphold their authority as long as they follow their own bylaws. Even if the easement is limited, they can argue that your activities impact their adjacent properties. But this is my land, I insisted. I'm not even hunting near their subdivision. It does not matter. The moment your predecessor signed that easement agreement, he created a legal gray area they can exploit. You could fight it, but you would be looking at legal fees far exceeding these fines, with no guarantee of success. I left his office feeling defeated, the folder of documents seeming heavier in my hands. The attorney's parting advice had been to simply pay the fines and stop hunting on my own property. The thought made my blood boil. This land represented not just my investment but my heritage and way of life. A week later, I stood at my kitchen window, absently stirring my morning coffee while watching the sunrise. Movement near the tree line caught my attention. I grabbed my binoculars from the hook by the door and focused on the eastern border of my property. A group of about 8 people in expensive outdoor gear walked along a well-maintained trail that cut through what was supposedly my land. At the front of the group was Victoria Harrington, gesturing animatedly as she led them through the woods. They stopped at a clearing, and I adjusted the focus to see more clearly. Victoria pointed in the direction of my house, and several people nodded, some even laughing. This was no casual hike. This appeared to be some sort of organized excursion. I watched as they continued along the trail, eventually disappearing into the woods beyond my property line. Grabbing my jacket, I decided to investigate the trail myself. 20 minutes later, I stood on the same path they had taken. It was surprisingly well-maintained, with gravel in some sections and wooden bridges over the seasonal creek beds. This was no deer path or casual walkway. Someone had invested considerable time and money into this trail system. The question was, who owned it? The county records office was housed in an aging government building downtown. The records clerk, a middle-aged woman named Martha with kind eyes and a patient demeanor, helped me access the property maps for the area surrounding my ranch. "You see here," she explained, her finger tracing along the boundary lines of a detailed survey map. "Your property ends at this ridge line. The eastern watershed area has this easement we discussed before, but this section here," she pointed to a significant tract of land adjacent to both my property and Oak Ridge Estates, This is actually owned by a limited liability company called Vista Holdings. Who is Vista Holdings? I asked, leaning closer to examine the map. Let me check that for you. Martha typed into her computer, then turned the screen so I could see. Vista Holdings LLC was formed in 2014. The registered agent is, interesting, Oak Ridge Management Corporation, which appears to be the entity that manages the homeowners association. My heart raced as the pieces started falling into place. So the HOA essentially controls this land through a separate company. Martha nodded. It appears so, and according to this, they acquired it for development purposes but have kept it undeveloped. There is a notation here about it being used as a nature preserve and recreational area for residents. I stared at the map, a plan slowly forming in my mind. Is this land currently for sale? Not officially listed, but Martha lowered her voice, glancing around the nearly empty office. There is a tax delinquency notice here. If the back taxes are not paid within 30 days, it goes to county auction next month. Minimum bid starts at the tax debt plus penalties. She pointed to a figure on the screen, 46,782.19. And when exactly is this auction? I asked, trying to keep my voice casual. June 15th, 9 a.m. at the county courthouse, Martha replied. She gave me a knowing look. Public auction. Anyone can attend. I thanked her and left the office, my mind racing with possibilities. The HOA was fining me for hunting on my own property, while they were leading exclusive hiking expeditions on land they controlled through a shell company land that was about to go to auction for unpaid taxes. The irony was almost too perfect. For the first time since receiving that first violation notice, I felt something beyond anger and frustration. I felt hope. The beginnings of a plan took shape as I drove home, the defeat of the past weeks giving way to determination. This was far from over. The financial reality of my situation spread before me on the dining room table. Bank statements, investment portfolios, loan documents, and property assessments created a sobering picture. I had poured nearly every cent I had into purchasing the ranch. Taking on the Vista Holdings property would require resources I simply did not have readily available. I pulled out a legal pad and began making lists. Assets I could liquidate quickly, items I could sell, potential sources for loans. The ranch itself was already leveraged for the purchase mortgage. My retirement account was substantially depleted, but I did have some options if I was willing to make sacrifices. My grandfather's vintage truck, which I had carefully restored over the years, could fetch a decent price. The collection of rare hunting rifles passed down through 3 generations might need to be sold, keeping just 1 or 2 for actual hunting. My savings bonds, originally set aside for emergencies, would have to be cashed out prematurely. By dawn, I had a plan. It would be tight and it would hurt, but I could potentially gather enough for the minimum bid plus a reasonable buffer for a bidding war if necessary. The question was whether it would be worth it. This was no small gamble. I needed professional guidance before proceeding, but not from someone like Bernard Michaels. I needed a specialist who understood property law and rural land disputes. After several calls and inquiries, I secured an appointment with Elaine Winters, an attorney whose office was located an hour away in the neighboring county. Unlike Michael's cluttered strip mall office, Winter's practice operated from a converted farmhouse with tasteful professional furnishings. The woman herself projected quiet competence, her gray-streaked hair cut in a practical bob, her handshake firm and direct. So you want to outmaneuver an HOA by purchasing their hiking land at a tax auction, she summarized after I explained my situation. Rather than dismissing the idea, she leaned forward with interest. Bold move, potentially very effective if executed properly. Is it legal? I asked. Perfectly legal. Tax auctions are open to the public, and you have every right to bid on available properties. She tapped her pen thoughtfully against her notepad. The question is whether you can manage the financial aspect and what your end goal would be. I explained my financial calculations and my primary objective: securing my right to hunt on my own property without HOA interference. I see several angles here, Winters said, making notes. First, leveraging the hiking land gives you a powerful bargaining position. Second, it exposes their hypocrisy in controlling adjacent land while imposing restrictions on yours. Third, it potentially invalidates portions of their easement claims if we can prove they misrepresented the nature of the adjacent property. For the next 2 hours, we developed a comprehensive strategy. Winters explained the auction process in detail, outlined potential legal challenges the HOA might attempt, and helped me prepare counterarguments for each scenario. Unlike Michael's, she saw a path forward that did not involve simply capitulating to unreasonable demands. Do not tell anyone about your plans, she cautioned as our meeting ended. Not neighbors, not friends, no one. The HOA has ears everywhere in that community. The following weeks passed in a flurry of activity. I photographed and listed my grandfather's truck on specialty automotive websites. I contacted a reputable firearms dealer about my collection. Each sale felt like giving away a piece of my history, but I reminded myself that the land itself, and what it represented, was worth the sacrifice. By early June, I had accumulated just over $60,000. It was everything I had, but it should be enough for the auction. Winters had researched Vista Holdings more deeply and discovered that while the HOA controlled it, few residents knew about the arrangement. This was primarily a pet project of the board, particularly Victoria Harrington, who used the exclusive hiking trails as a status symbol and gathering place for her inner circle. The morning of the auction arrived with clear skies and mild temperatures. I dressed conservatively in khakis and a button-down shirt, attempting to blend in with the professional property developers likely to attend. Winters had advised me to sit in the back, avoid drawing attention, and to use small, discreet bidding gestures. The county courthouse auction room was about half full when I arrived. Most attendees were indeed professionals in business attire, clutching folders and speaking in hushed tones about properties and values. I took a seat in the back row as planned, reviewing the auction catalog to locate the Vista Holdings parcel. The auctioneer, a fast-talking older gentleman with reading glasses perched on the end of his nose, began promptly at 9 a.m. The first several properties sold quickly, mostly abandoned urban lots and foreclosed homes. My heart rate increased as they approached the rural properties section. Next item, parcel number 8452B, approximately 28 acres of undeveloped land adjacent to Oak Ridge Estates subdivision. Current zoning recreational agricultural. Minimum bid $46,782.19 for delinquent taxes and penalties. I raised my number discreetly as instructed. 2 other bidders showed interest: a woman in a real estate company polo shirt and an older man in an expensive suit. The bidding moved quickly. I have 50,000. Do I hear 55? My heart pounded as the numbers climbed. 55, 60. I raised my card again at 65,000, nearly my entire budget. 65,000 from number 27 in the back. Do I hear 70? The real estate agent dropped out. Only the older man remained, eyeing the property description thoughtfully. Please stop, I thought, my palms sweating. 65 going once. The man raised his card. 70,000 from number 14. I swallowed hard. This was it, my absolute limit. One final bid. 75,000. I signaled, stretching beyond my prepared funds into territory that would require selling even more possessions. The older man glanced back at me, seeming to measure my determination, then shook his head slightly. 75,000 going once, going twice. Sold to bidder number 27 for $75,000. A wave of emotions crashed over me: relief, anxiety, exhilaration, fear. I had just spent every penny I had and committed to finding more. As I signed the paperwork and handed over the cashier's check for the deposit, the reality of what I had done began to sink in. This was either the smartest or the most foolish financial decision of my life. The drive home felt surreal. In my briefcase were the preliminary ownership documents for the Vista Holdings property, the very trails that Victoria Harrington and her friends used for their exclusive hikes. In 30 days, once the title transferred and all paperwork was complete, I would own the land outright. The magnitude of what lay ahead was daunting, but for the first time in months, I felt a sense of control returning. The HOA had pushed me to the financial brink with their unreasonable demands and fines. Now it was my turn to push back. The county clerk's office became my second home over the next few weeks. I filed the necessary paperwork to transfer the Vista Holdings property into my name, paid the remaining balance with funds secured from selling additional possessions, and began the process of formally establishing the new boundary lines. Each document I signed brought me closer to implementing my plan. The clerk handling my paperwork, a young man with a neatly trimmed beard and sympathetic eyes, looked up from the boundary adjustment forms I had just submitted. "You know, this is going to raise some eyebrows once it is processed," he commented quietly. "Vista Holdings property has been a point of contention for years." "How so?" I asked, trying to sound merely curious. "The HOA has been using it as a private nature preserve while keeping it under a separate LLC to avoid certain tax and insurance obligations. Very few people even know who actually owns it." He stamped my form and added it to a folder. "These adjustments will be public record by next Tuesday. Just giving you a heads up." I thanked him for the information and left with a copy of my receipt. The clock was ticking now. Once the paperwork became public, the HOA would discover what I had done. I needed to be ready. Meanwhile, the harassment from the HOA continued unabated. Another violation notice arrived, this one threatening to place a lien on my property for the unpaid fines, which now totaled over $5,000. I placed it unopened on top of the growing pile on my kitchen counter. Let them waste their time and resources generating paperwork. Soon, none of it would matter. Under the cover of early morning fog, I drove to the hardware store 2 towns over where no one would recognize me. I purchased several large, private property signs, metal posts, a new chain, and a heavy-duty padlock. The cashier raised an eyebrow at my purchases. "Having trouble with trespassers?" she asked conversationally. "Something like that," I replied with a noncommittal smile. The following morning, I hiked the perimeter of my newly acquired land, mapping the main trail entrances and exits. There were 3 primary access points, one connecting directly to the Oak Ridge Estates Community Center parking lot, another from a cul-de-sac in the most expensive section of the subdivision, and a third that connected to my own eastern property line. All 3 would need to be secured simultaneously when the time came. From the shelter of the trees bordering the main trail, I watched Victoria's hiking group gather for their weekly excursion. They arrived in luxury vehicles, sporting expensive outdoor gear despite the mild terrain. Victoria stood at the center, gesturing dramatically as she spoke, occasionally pointing out features of their nature preserve. I took careful note of their routine Thursday mornings, 9 a.m. sharp, returning approximately 11:30 a.m. The perfect time to implement the final phase of my plan. Back at home, I met with Attorney Winters to review the legal aspects of what I intended to do. Your property ownership is now officially recorded, she confirmed, reviewing the documentation. You have every legal right to restrict access to your land. However, be prepared for immediate legal challenges from the HOA. What kind of challenges? They will likely claim prescriptive easement due to established use of the trails, or try to argue that the tax sale was somehow improper. She closed her folder decisively. Both arguments would fail. The tax sale was completely legitimate, and they cannot claim prescriptive easement when they were the previous owners through their shell company. They knowingly maintained the property under separate ownership. We spent the afternoon preparing notices of private property rights and trespassing warnings that cited relevant state laws. Winters also drafted a formal letter to the HOA board explaining that the Vista Holdings property had been purchased at public auction, and all previous access rights were terminated effective immediately. "Are you absolutely certain you want to proceed?" Winters asked as she was leaving. "This will create significant conflict with your neighbors." I looked out my window at the land I had sacrificed so much to protect. Those people were never going to be my neighbors in any meaningful sense of the word, not after how they have treated me. The night before my planned confrontation, I sat on my porch watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant oranges and purples. I thought about my grandfather and what he would think of all this. He had always taught me to stand up for what was right, but also to be strategic rather than reactionary. Tomorrow would change everything. I checked my watch and mentally reviewed my timeline once more. By this time tomorrow, Victoria Harrington and her entitled friends would discover just how it felt to have someone else controlling access to land they considered their own. The thought brought a smile to my face as darkness settled over the ranch. The calm was pleasant, but I was ready for the storm. Dawn broke with a gentle mist hanging over the fields. I had been awake for hours, reviewing every detail of my plan. The property ownership documents and legal notices were organized in a leather portfolio. The no trespassing signs, chains, and padlocks waited in the bed of my truck. Today was the day everything would change. I arrived at the trailheads shortly after sunrise, starting with the access point furthest from the Oak Ridge Estates Community Center. Working methodically, I hammered metal posts into the ground at 10-foot intervals along the boundary line and attached the bright red "private property" and "no trespassing" signs. Each one included the relevant state trespassing statute number at the bottom in smaller print, as Winters had advised. At the main trail entrances, I installed heavy wooden barriers with the chains and padlocks. The official notices were laminated and attached prominently where they could not be missed. By 8:30 a.m., all 3 access points were secured, and I positioned myself in a natural blind near the community center entrance, the most likely arrival point for Victoria's hiking group. Right on schedule, luxury vehicles began arriving. Victoria's white Range Rover pulled into a reserved parking space near the trailhead. She emerged wearing tailored hiking pants, a lightweight performance jacket, and a wide-brimmed hat that looked more appropriate for a garden party than a nature walk. 6 other people joined her, all similarly outfitted in expensive outdoor gear. "Ladies, before we begin, I want to remind everyone about the Endangered Wildflower Preservation initiative we discussed last week, Victoria announced, her voice carrying easily across the parking lot. As stewards of this pristine natural area, it is our responsibility to. Her voice cut off abruptly as she turned toward the trailhead and noticed the wooden barrier and chain. The group fell silent, staring in confusion. What on earth? Victoria strode toward the entrance, her hiking companions following uncertainly behind her. She read the notice, then ripped it from the post. This is ridiculous, some kind of prank. She grabbed the chain with both hands and pulled, but the padlock held firm. Her face flushed with anger as she turned to her group. Someone has vandalized our nature preserve, probably those teenagers from the North Subdivision. She pulled out her phone. I am calling Mark from the maintenance committee. He will have tools to remove this immediately. That was my cue. I emerged from my hiding spot and walked calmly toward the group. Victoria's eyes widened when she recognized me, her phone still pressed to her ear. "Mr. Turner," she said coldly, lowering the phone slightly. "Did you have something to do with this obstruction of community property?" "Not community property, Mrs. Harrington," I replied, keeping my voice level and professional. "My property." Her perfectly sculpted eyebrows drew together. "What are you talking about? This land belongs to Vista Holdings, LLC, which is managed by the Oak Ridge Estates HOA for the benefit of our residents." I opened my portfolio and removed the property deed. Vista Holdings failed to pay county taxes for the past 3 years. The property was sold at public auction last month. I am the new owner, and I have decided to close these trails effective immediately. Victoria's face cycled rapidly through expressions: confusion, disbelief, and then dawning horror as she realized I was telling the truth. She snatched the deed from my hands and scanned it frantically. "This is not possible," she hissed, her composed facade cracking. "The HOA maintains these trails for exclusive resident use. We have invested thousands in their development." "Yes, I am aware of that," I replied. "The same HOA that has been fining me for hunting on my own property has been operating an exclusive hiking club on land they controlled through a shell company. Land they have now lost due to their own failure to pay taxes." The other hikers began murmuring among themselves, looking uncomfortable as they realized what was happening. One woman in a lavender jacket stepped forward. "Victoria, is this true? Does the HOA actually own these trails through a separate company?" Victoria ignored her, focusing her fury entirely on me. "You have no idea what you have done. Our attorneys will have this reversed by the end of the day. This is a clear case of," she paused, searching for a legal term, "of prescriptive rights through established use." I had anticipated this argument, thanks to Attorney Winters. Actually, there can be no prescriptive easement claim when your organization was the previous owner through Vista Holdings. You deliberately maintained separate ownership while restricting use to select residents. My attorney has prepared a comprehensive brief explaining the legal details if you would like to review it. Victoria's carefully maintained composure finally shattered completely. She threw the deed on the ground and stepped toward me, her finger jabbing the air inches from my face. "You think you are clever, do not you? Playing property games to avoid paying your legitimate fines. This is exactly the kind of underhanded, disruptive behavior we work to prevent in our community." "Interesting perspective," I replied calmly. "From where I stand, it looks like your HOA has been using selective enforcement and questionable legal tactics to harass a property owner engaging in perfectly legal activities on his own land." You cannot just close established trails that our community has used for years." Her voice had risen to a shout, drawing stares from people passing by. "Actually, I can, and I have." I gestured to the barrier and signs. "This is legally my property now, and anyone crossing that boundary is trespassing, something your HOA seems particularly concerned about when it involves other people's land." The woman in the lavender jacket touched Victoria's arm. "Perhaps we should discuss this at an emergency board meeting, Victoria. This is getting out of hand." Victoria shook off her touch, her face flushed with anger. "He cannot do this. These trails are for Oak Ridge residents. We paid for them. We maintained them." "Through a separate company that failed to pay its taxes," I reminded her. "If you would like to discuss a potential easement agreement moving forward, I am open to that conversation, after all outstanding fines against my property are withdrawn." "Blackmail," Victoria spat. "This is nothing but blatant blackmail." "I prefer to call it negotiation," I replied. "Something your HOA has been unwilling to engage in until now." Victoria turned to the increasingly uncomfortable hiking group. "We are calling an emergency board meeting immediately. Mr. Peterson, contact our attorney." She shot me a venomous glare. "This is not over, Turner. Not by a long shot. We will see how smugly you stand there when our legal team gets involved." As the group dispersed, with Victoria still ranting about lawsuits and property rights, I remained beside the locked trail entrance. The confrontation had gone almost exactly as I had anticipated, perhaps even better. Victoria's public meltdown had revealed the truth about the HOA's ownership arrangement to residents who appeared genuinely surprised by the revelation. I collected my portfolio and the deed Victoria had thrown to the ground. The first battle was won, but I had no illusions that the war was over. The HOA would fight back with everything they had. But for the first time since moving to my ranch, I felt a sense of validation and control. The land beneath my feet was mine, fair and square, and no amount of HOA bluster could change that fact. News traveled through Oak Ridge Estates with remarkable speed. By that evening, my phone began ringing with calls from neighbors I had not spoken to in months. Some were angry, demanding access to their trails. Others were curious, asking pointed questions about Vista Holdings and how the HOA had acquired and managed the property. A few were even supportive, admitting they had long been frustrated with Victoria's autocratic leadership style. The emergency HOA meeting was scheduled for the following evening. Attorney Winters accompanied me, her calm professionalism a stark contrast to the tension filling the community center meeting room. Nearly every seat was taken, with residents lining the walls. Victoria sat at the center of the board table, her face a rigid mask of composure that did not quite hide her fury. "The board has consulted with our legal team regarding the situation with our nature preserve," she began, carefully avoiding any mention of Vista Holdings or private ownership. "We are pursuing all available remedies to restore community access to these valuable recreational resources." Winters and I sat quietly as Victoria outlined the HOA's position, claiming established use rights and suggesting I had somehow acted improperly in purchasing the property. When she finished, an older resident in the back raised his hand. "I have been on the budget committee for 6 years," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the room. "Why was the board paying property taxes for this land through a separate company instead of as HOA common property? And why were those taxes allowed to go unpaid?" The question hung in the air. Victoria stumbled through a response about complex management structures and administrative oversights. More hands went up. More questions followed. The carefully crafted narrative was unraveling. Over the following weeks, the HOA's legal challenges failed one by one. As Winters had predicted, they could not claim prescriptive rights when they had been the previous owners, and the tax sale was entirely legitimate. Their final attempt, claiming the original easement on my property gave them permanent access rights to adjacent lands, was dismissed by the county judge with visible frustration. 3 months after the confrontation at the trailhead, a different kind of letter arrived at my door. This one bore the Oak Ridge Estates HOA letterhead, but was signed by Thomas Peterson, the new interim HOA president. Victoria had been asked to resign following a community vote of no confidence. We would like to meet and discuss a mutually beneficial resolution to our ongoing property dispute, it read. The tone was conciliatory, professional, and entirely unlike the demanding notices I had received before. The meeting took place on my porch, with Mr. Peterson and 2 other board members sitting across from me at the outdoor table. Gone was the hostility and condescension that had characterized previous interactions. "We propose a formal agreement," Peterson explained. "The HOA acknowledges your legal right to hunt on your property with reasonable safety measures in place. In exchange, we request limited hiking access to your acquired property for residents, with clear hours and usage guidelines." "And the accumulated fines?" I asked. "All violations and penalties have been voided," Peterson confirmed, sliding a document across the table. "We are prepared to put this unfortunate situation behind us and establish a more neighborly relationship moving forward." The terms were fair, better than fair. The agreement recognized my property rights while allowing controlled community access to the trails they had long enjoyed. Most importantly, it established a framework of mutual respect and clear boundaries. 6 months after signing the agreement, I stood on my porch as the morning sun illuminated the autumn landscape. A small group of hikers followed the trail along the eastern boundary, keeping to the designated path as agreed. In the distance, a deer and her fawn grazed peacefully near the creek. Inside, my grandfather's remaining hunting rifles hung proudly on the wall. I had managed to buy back 2 of them after the property dispute was resolved. The financial strain had been significant, but the principle had been worth fighting for. Later that afternoon, I was preparing to head out for the first hunt of the season when a truck pulled into my driveway. Mr. Peterson stepped out, holding a small package. "The community wanted you to have this," he said, handing me the carefully wrapped gift. Inside was a handcrafted wooden sign reading "Turner Ranch, established 2023. "Consider it a peace offering," Peterson explained, "and a reminder that good fences and clear boundaries make good neighbors." I hung the sign by my front gate that evening. As I drove back up my driveway, I caught sight of it silhouetted against the setting sun. This land was more than just property now. It was home, hard-won and rightfully mine. The battle with the HOA had cost me financially, but what I gained in return, respect, clear boundaries, and the right to honor my family traditions, was worth every penny.